March 1982. Studio One, NBC Burbank. The red light above camera 2 held steady, and somewhere in the control room a producer checked his watch twice in the same minute. The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson was not simply a television program, it was the last unifying ritual of the American evening, the place where 30 million people gathered in separate living rooms to confirm they still belonged to the same country. By the early 1980s, Carson had occupied that desk for 2 decades, and the mechanics of his authority had become invisible. He did not shout, he did not lecture, he merely sat with his microphone angled just so and decided, live in real time, who would be welcomed into American living rooms and who would be gently, irreversibly escorted out. What made Carson dangerous was not cruelty, it was precision. He had developed, over 10,000 broadcasts, the ability to locate the exact moment when a guest's public persona separated from the person underneath, and then, almost casually, he would apply pressure to that seam. The audience at home rarely understood what they were watching. They saw a smile, they heard laughter, but the guest, sitting 4 feet away from Carson under lights bright enough to erase shadows, felt something else entirely. The sensation of being seen without permission. The interviews that became legendary were not the ones where Carson destroyed his guests. They were the ones where he allowed destruction to occur in real time on national television while maintaining the appearance of polite conversation. This was not spectacle. It was something older and more unsettling, a public reckoning disguised as entertainment. In 1973, Carson interviewed a United States senator who had built his career on moral certainty. The senator arrived expecting what every politician expected from late-night television, a friendly platform, rehearsed applause, and 6 minutes to speak directly to voters without the filter of journalists. He had been briefed by his staff, he had talking points, he had a smile practiced in mirrors and refined in committee hearings. Carson opened with a question so simple it seemed irrelevant. He asked the senator about a vote from 9 years earlier, a minor procedural matter that had been buried in congressional records and forgotten by everyone except, apparently, Johnny Carson. The senator hesitated, not long, perhaps 2 seconds, but long enough for 20 million people to notice. He attempted redirection, a technique that worked flawlessly in Senate hearings. Carson let him redirect. He did not interrupt, he did not challenge, he simply waited until the senator finished his answer, and then he asked the same question again with one word changed. The audience did not laugh, they did not applaud, they leaned forward in their living rooms, sensing something beneath the surface of the conversation, a structure they could not name but recognized instinctively. The senator, a man who had spent 30 years mastering the language of political evasion, discovered that his tools did not function here. Carson's desk was not a Senate chamber. There were no procedural rules, no allies to yield time to, no recess to call. There was only the red light, the microphone, and a man who had perfected the art of patient silence. By the 4th question, the senator's voice had changed. The rehearsed warmth was gone. In its place was something unfiltered, frustration, defensiveness, the tone of a man who had lost control of a conversation and did not understand how. Carson never raised his voice, he never leaned forward, he maintained the posture of a gracious host, but the studio audience, trained by 2 decades to read Carson's smallest gestures, began to shift in their seats. The applause at the end was brief and uncertain. The senator's career did not end that night, but something ended. 3 newspapers ran editorials within the week, all referencing the interview. His opponents began using the footage in campaign advertisements. Years later, a political historian would describe the moment as the first time a late-night talk show permanently altered a Senate race. Carson himself never mentioned it again. He did not need to. The footage existed, and the footage did not forget. The Tonight Show desk was not furniture, it was a border. On one side sat the guest, exposed under lights calibrated to eliminate shadows, holding a coffee mug filled with water, wearing a microphone clipped to clothing chosen for cameras, not comfort. On the other side sat Carson, who controlled the microphone angles, the camera cuts, the length of commercial breaks, and, most crucially, the tone of the room. The desk was Carson's territory, and every guest who sat across from him was, in a sense, crossing into foreign ground without a map. This was not always apparent. Carson's genius lay in making the structure invisible. He smiled. He laughed. He created the impression of effortless conversation, two people talking as though cameras did not exist. But everyone in that studio knew the truth. The guest could be brilliant, charming, prepared, and still, if Carson withdrew his attention even slightly, the interview would collapse. The audience at home would feel it before they could name it, the cold absence of approval. In 1979, Carson interviewed a comedian who had built a career on shock. The comedian arrived with material designed to provoke, to push boundaries, to generate controversy that would be discussed in newspapers and living rooms the next morning. He delivered his first line, a joke calculated to offend, and waited for the reaction. Carson did not laugh. He did not frown. He did not lean forward or pull back. He simply looked at the comedian with an expression that communicated, more clearly than words ever could, that the joke had failed. The comedian attempted recovery. He tried a second joke, then a third, each one more desperate than the last. The studio audience, trained to follow Carson's lead, remained silent, not hostile, not offended, simply absent. The comedian, a man who had performed in sold-out theaters and survived hostile crowds, discovered that silence on The Tonight Show was different from silence anywhere else. It was the silence of a crowd waiting to be won over. It was the silence of judgment already rendered. Carson let the interview continue for 8 minutes. He did not humiliate his guest. He did not attack. He merely withdrew his endorsement, and in doing so, he demonstrated the limits of the comedian's power. The comedian left the stage to polite applause. He was never invited back. Within 2 years, his career had collapsed. Historians of comedy would later debate whether Carson destroyed him or simply revealed what was already true. The microphone was the key. Every guest who sat at Carson's desk wore one, a small black clip attached to a tie or collar, connected by a thin wire to the control room. It was a technological necessity, easy to ignore, but in Carson's hands, it became something else, a reminder of who controlled the broadcast. Carson could adjust his microphone mid-sentence, creating space for a punchline. He could lean away from it, forcing the guest to carry the conversation alone. He could, with a single gesture to the control booth, lower a guest's audio level, making their words harder to hear, their presence less substantial. Most guests never noticed. They were too focused on their own performance, their own nervousness, their own desire to be liked by 30 million people simultaneously. But some guests, usually the ones who had spent years in front of cameras, understood immediately. They recognized the microphone for what it was, a leash, invisible but absolute. In 1985, Carson interviewed an actress who had just published a memoir filled with accusations against former colleagues, revelations about studio corruption, and detailed accounts of personal betrayals. She arrived expecting confrontation. She had prepared defenses, rehearsed justifications, anticipated every possible challenge to her narrative. Carson did not challenge her. He did not ask about the accusations. He did not reference the memoir at all. He asked instead about her first acting role, a small part in a television drama from 30 years earlier. The actress, confused but relieved, answered. Carson asked another question, equally benign, then another. For 11 minutes, he conducted an interview that could have been recorded in 1960, as though the memoir did not exist, as though the controversy that had consumed entertainment journalism for 6 weeks was simply beneath discussion. The actress smiled. She told stories. She laughed at Carson's jokes. And slowly, as the interview continued, she began to understand what was happening. Carson was erasing her, not through confrontation, but through indifference. By refusing to engage with the memoir, by treating her as though she were still the young actress from 3 decades ago, he was communicating to 30 million viewers that her revelations did not matter, that her accusations were not worth acknowledging, that she was, despite the best-selling book in the magazine covers, irrelevant. The interview ended with warm applause.
The actress never appeared on The Tonight Show again. The memoir disappeared from bestseller lists within a month. Control in Carson's hands was a form of mercy.
He could have destroyed guests. He had the platform, the audience, and the skill. But destruction was crude, and Carson was never crude. He preferred something more subtle. The controlled revelation of weakness, administered in doses calibrated to create discomfort without crossing into cruelty. He believed, or seemed to believe, that public figures who could not withstand gentle scrutiny did not deserve the protection of his desk. This was not a philosophy he articulated. Carson rarely discussed his methods. He gave few interviews, avoided retrospectives, and declined invitations to explain the mechanics of his authority. But his producers understood, the guests understood, and America, watching from living rooms and hotel bars and hospital waiting rooms, understood without needing to be told. The Tonight Show was not a place where you went to be celebrated. It was a place where you went to be tested, and whether you passed or failed was determined by a man who had learned to communicate judgment through the smallest adjustments of posture and tone. In 1981, Carson interviewed a talk show host whose program competed directly with The Tonight Show in certain markets. The host arrived projecting confidence, eager to demonstrate that he belonged in the same category as Carson, that he was not a rival, but a peer. Carson began the interview with compliments. He praised the host's ratings, his interview style, his recent guests. The host, flattered and disarmed, relaxed. And then Carson asked a question about the host's production process, how many writers he employed, how jokes were selected, how guests were booked. The host answered honestly, too honestly. He revealed the scaffolding behind his program, the number of people required to create the illusion of spontaneity, the careful engineering of moments that appeared effortless. Carson listened without interrupting. He smiled, he nodded. And when the host finished, Carson made a single joke, not mean, not cutting, just a gentle observation about the difference between a staff of 40 and a staff of 12. The studio audience laughed. The host laughed. But everyone watching understood what had just occurred. Carson had revealed the machinery, and in doing so, he had demonstrated that his own program operated on a different principle entirely. The competing show was canceled within 18 months. Carson never mentioned it again. The curtain was always the same. Blue, heavy, designed to absorb sound and light. Every night for 30 years, Carson walked through that curtain while the band played and the audience stood, and for those few seconds he was invisible, neither offstage nor onstage, suspended between private preparation and public performance. It was the only moment in the broadcast when Carson was not being watched, and perhaps that was why it mattered. The curtain represented the boundary between the person and the persona, the space where Ed McMahon's voice announced, "Here's Johnny," and a man became an institution. Guests did not walk through that curtain. They entered from stage right, already visible, already performing. They did not get the protection of invisibility, the brief shelter of transition. They were public from the first step. And that difference, small, almost trivial, meant everything.
In 1977, Carson interviewed a writer who had spent years criticizing television, arguing in essays and lectures that talk shows had degraded American discourse, that hosts like Carson wielded unearned influence, that the entire format was a corruption of meaningful conversation. Carson invited him onto the show. The writer accepted, perhaps believing that the appearance would give him a platform to present his arguments to a larger audience. He was wrong. Carson did not debate him. He did not defend television. He simply let the writer speak, asking brief questions, offering no resistance. The writer delivered his criticisms with eloquence and precision. The studio audience listened in near silence, and when the writer finished, Carson thanked him, smiled, and went to commercial. The audience applauded politely. The writer left through the same door he had entered. The next guest was a comedian who told 3 jokes about dinner parties. The audience roared. The contrast was absolute and devastating. Carson had not argued against the writer's thesis. He had simply demonstrated, through the structure of the broadcast itself, that criticism of television meant nothing when delivered on television, that the medium absorbed all attacks and converted them into content. The writer never appeared again. His next book sold poorly. Some interviews were never broadcast. The Tonight Show taped in the late afternoon, then aired at 11:30 p.m. Eastern, and in the hours between recording and transmission, decisions were made. Segments were cut. Jokes were removed. Occasionally, entire interviews disappeared, replaced by extended musical performances or pre-recorded comedy sketches. The official explanations were always technical: time constraints, pacing issues, content concerns, but everyone in the industry understood. Some guests failed the test so completely that their presence had to be erased. These were not scandals. They were not controversies. They were simply moments when the distance between a guest's public image and their actual presence became too great to ignore. When the machinery of fame broke down on live television and revealed something the audience was not supposed to see. Carson and the producers who served him believed that America did not need to witness these failures. The footage existed, archived in NBC vaults, but it was not meant for broadcast. It was evidence of a truth that Carson understood better than almost anyone: that celebrity was fragile, that charisma could evaporate under pressure, and that the work of The Tonight Show was not to destroy illusions, but to maintain them, except when maintenance was no longer possible. May 1992, Studio One. The applause sign blinked off, and Johnny Carson stood behind his desk for the last time. 30 years, 10,000 broadcasts, an entire architecture of American culture built around one desk, one curtain, one microphone. He had interviewed presidents and criminals, astronauts and con artists, legends and frauds. He had made careers and ended them, often in the same week. He had become the person America trusted to tell them, without words, what mattered and what did not. The final broadcast contained no darkness, no uncomfortable interviews, no tests. Carson had already said everything he needed to say, and he had said it not through speeches, but through 30 years of small gestures, controlled silences, and the careful application of attention and withdrawal. The show ended with a monologue, a few guests, and a simple goodbye. The curtain closed, the red light went dark. But the footage remained. The interviews that were never explained. The moments that were carefully cut. The tests the guests failed without understanding they were being tested. They existed in archives and memories, in oral histories told by producers and recounted by guests who never fully recovered. They were proof that Johnny Carson had understood something essential about American television, that the most powerful form of control was the kind that felt like conversation, and the most devastating form of judgment was the kind delivered with a smile. The desk was just furniture. The microphone was just technology. The curtain was just fabric. But in Johnny Carson's hands, they became instruments of a power that America granted willingly, night after night, for 3 decades. The power to decide who belonged in the living room, and who would be quietly, professionally, permanently shown the door.